In the new book, The West, A New History in 14 Lives, prize-winning historian Naoíse Mac Sweeney unpacks the myths and origin stories that underpin the history we thought we knew about Western civilization and examines the institutions and structures that have been built on the shaky foundation through the lives and times of 14 remarkable individuals from antiquity to modern day. These 14 figures each played a role in the creation and execution of the Western idea. These characters span millennia and the continents, representing different religions, varying levels of wealth and education, diverse traditions and nationalities. Each life tells us something unexpected about the age in which it was lived and offers us a piece of the puzzle of how the modern idea of the West developed and why we've misunderstood it for so long. The name of the new book is The West, A New History in 14 Lives. Naoíse Mac Sweeney joins us this morning. Thank you so much for being with us. A great pleasure to have you on the program.
Hi, Joe. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Professor of Classical Archaeology at the University of Vienna and has been a researcher at Harvard's Center for Hellenic Studies. And again, the new book is The West. What brought you to these particular 14 lives?
Well, Joe, it was really difficult to narrow it down. I wanted to tell real stories of real people, real historical figures that, you and I can connect to. But I wanted to choose people that came not just from the span of Western history chronologically, but also to capture something of the kind of exciting diversity of Western history geographically as well. So I had some characters from the Americas, from Europe, but also from Asia and Africa too, which it was important to me to expand that geographical perspective. And I really wanted to include different genders, people also from different parts of society. So I didn't want to make this just about kings and queens. It was really important to me that we included some voices of people who led different kinds of lives, people that maybe you and I can relate to more directly.
How much of an identity crisis was the West in as you thought about this project?
Well, I don't know, Joe. I'm sure you can comment on it just as much as I can, but it feels like in the last 5 or so years, the West has really been struggling to decide not just what it is today, but where it wants to be. What is the ideal of the West and what should the West be? And not very many people are very happy with what the West is right now. I think there are people who are critiquing it from both sides of the political spectrum. There are people who think the West should be very different in one direction and people who think it should be very different in another direction. And what they both have in common is that they want to change it. So we really are at a moment, I think, where there's a lot of appetite for change, and it's a good historical moment for us to be doing that rethinking actively and decide what we want the West to be as we move into the middle of the 21st century.
So how did that give you a sense of what historically you needed to include and what you wanted to look at through this new history in these 14 lives?
So, as you said, Joe, I'm kind of professionally a historian and an archaeologist. So, every year we get a whole batch of excited new students coming in, young people, and they think they know what Western history is or what it should be. So when it came to putting the book together, I wanted to make sure I captured a little bit of what they expect, what my students expect when they come in, but also the things that they don't expect, the things that might surprise them or amuse them or catch their interest over the course of their years beginning to study history. And I wanted to kind of to bring those two things together, the expected and the unexpected, to tell this much bigger story about where the West actually came from.
When you think about a starting point, or for you as you were thinking of a starting point, where did you want to go? Where's a good jumping off point?
Well, I knew I had to start in the ancient Greek world For two reasons. First, it's personal because that's my bread and butter, my daily grind. It's what I teach every day at university, I suppose, and it's how I got into this. So that was the personal, but also it is where we start our story of the origins of the West. So often you hear that the birthplace of the West was in ancient Greek democracy and ideas of ancient Greek science and culture. We often say that Western literature begins with the epic poetry of Homer and it comes up through the centuries from there. So ancient Greece is really, it is the foundation myth, the origin myth that the West tells itself that it comes from. And I really just wanted to unpack that a bit, because the more you delve into ancient Greece, the more alien it is and the more different it is to the modern West. And I wanted to bring out some of those contrasts as well as some of the continuities.
When you think of those, as I said, you go through the jumping off point, but each of these figures played a role in the creation and execution of the Western idea. And as I said in the introduction, they span millennia and the continents. At what point through history do we start to realize what those contributions were, are, and have been, and how they intersect with one another?
Oh, Joe, that's such a difficult question. Oh my gosh. You know what? I think honestly, the story, the connections between these figures, it changes depending on what your stance and what your perspective is. So, as somebody who is living in the West, writing inside the West, who is of the West, I see the connections to my kind of cultural background in all of these figures. But I think if you were writing and living in another part of the world, in another tradition, the connections would be very different. And I think that was one of the other things I wanted to capture in this book, that although the facts of history are very much, they are the facts of history. You can't dispute them. But it's the way you link them up, right, which looks different to everybody. And that's what can often be subjective, or it can be politically inflected, it can be changed, or it can be politically impacted on as well. And that was one of the other big messages I did want to get through in this book, that although the facts of history are there, the way that we stitch them together into a story can really vary. And depending on your perspective and often depending on your political outlook as well.
What fascinated you the most as you were going through this, of as you said it from the beginning, it's finding the 14, but what fascinated you the most this is obviously a subject you know very well, but to pare it down into this particular story of this bird's eye view of thousands of years of how, and I'm going to use this word again, this intersection of the lives that you chose to tell this huge story?
For me, there was a common touch point in all of them, and that's how they look back to their own past. And, it comes time and time again to these ideas of, Western identity. And often, your identity is often encapsulated in where you say you came from. So where you come from is often a kind of a capsule way, a shorthand way of saying who you really are. And because ancient Greece is where we say the West comes from, it gives us a big ingredient, a big kind of chunk of what we think Western identity is. And so with all of these figures, when they look back into the past, they see a different past. So some of them would draw the lines of genealogical origin back to ancient Greece or the West, but some of them wouldn't. Some of them would draw these kind of civilizational genealogies in quite different ways. So the common thread, if there is kind of a single thread that runs through all of them, it is how each of them are constructing their own vision of history and how different that is, sometimes quite shockingly different from our vision of history. And that just gives us, that really demonstrates quite how subjective and changeable visions of history can be.
In this narrative, in your narrative, talk to us about the changing of Western ideals, of what we have seen as those ideals, and they're morphing into from one thing to another.
Western ideals, I suppose that is something which is more relevant over the last few hundred years or so, from about the 17th century onwards. The idea of what the West was, where it was geographically, has changed very much over that last kind of 3.5 centuries. But also what the West was morally, and as you say, ideals. And when it emerges, this idea of the emergent West, it is aligned primarily with Central and then Northern Europe, Northern Western Europe, and it's aligned with a kind of a European Christian kind of matrix. But in order to do that, it kind of closes its eyes and its ears and ignores the kind of the much broader world of Christianity in Christendom, which is beyond Europe, which, we often lose sight of Asian and African Christianities at this time. So it kind of artificially creates this kind of European Christian focus. And then over time, as we move into especially kind of the later 17th century and 18th century, the geographical focus becomes much more around the Atlantic. And it's the Atlantic western coast of Europe plus North America, which really become the kind of the heartland of what the West is imagined to be. And then the idea is it becomes unyoked slightly from Christianity, and it becomes focused much more on questions of political structure, representative democracy, and in North America as well, republicanism. And so the idea of what the West is changes even then from one century to the next. And then as we move into the 19th century, there is a greater emphasis on the relationship between the West and the rest. So the idea of the West is a certain portion of the world and its peoples, which is not only able, but is rightfully able to dominate the rest. So this is obviously in the form of European, especially imperialism and Western imperialism. But then, if we move forward again to the end of the 20th century and now into the 21st, that's not the world that we live in anymore. And for most of us, that's not the world that we want to live in anymore, a world of imperialism. And so the ideas of what the West were 100 years ago they don't fit with our society anymore. So again, we need to be updating our ideas of what the West are now. So from each century to the next, each century has reimagined the West and has reimagined its moral compass. And what I'm trying to argue in this book is it's absolutely high time for us to be doing that now.
How do we begin doing that?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think we have to begin this in dialogue with each other. We have a lot of people with strong ideas about this, and the trouble at the moment is that we are not talking to each other, we're talking past each other. There's been a very stark polarization of political discourse, and nobody on either side of the equation wants to hear what people on the others have to say. And this means we're not going to build something together. If we keep talking past one another like this, it's never going to move forward. And it's not fun. I don't often like listening to opinions other than my own. I don't like being challenged or being told that I'm wrong. But it's really important to admit that sometimes you're wrong, and it's really important to hear the other side. And we've got to get back into the habit of doing that, I think.
And also, to admit and to understand that this hasn't been pretty, and that there are contradictions, and there's bloodshed and wars and the very uncomfortable facts that have to emerge as we have these conversations.
Yeah, that's it. And we have to get used to being uncomfortable. So, I mean, looking back through Western history, there are, wonderful things and amazing things and exciting things and glorious things, but there are also things which are dark and which are shameful. And there are things that we have to really, really come to reckon with. So I think trying to take an unflinching look at those things is important for all of us.
Are you optimistic that we can get past the challenges, the barriers, and have those conversations in a more open and understanding dialogue? Joe,
I think I am. I'm less optimistic, I think, about my generation and perhaps the generation before me, and I'm not going to make any suggestion about yourself, but certainly my generation. But when I look at my students, right, I think they're different. I think they are much more international. I have students who will, in Vienna, in the middle of Central Europe, who will have friends that they will chat with, who are in Shanghai or who are in Boston or who are, across the world. And that's they're more open, I think, than maybe people of my own generation are. And they've grown up the world is different. Communications are different for them. And I think maybe it's not my generation that might have the answers, but I'm hopeful for the next one.
And in being hopeful that the and through that, I mean, where you fit in, obviously, and where this book fits in is understanding that history of what came before.
Yeah, I think it's the first step to try and look back and confront this history, but not just to see the history. I think there are so many brilliant history books out there which we all should be reading, but also to understand why out of all the histories out there and all the wonderful, diverse things, it could have been 140 lives, not 14, but why out of all of those possible paths, we've tended to focus, we've focused on one story, or we have made one historical line. We've made a kind of a golden thread out of Western history. And I think we need to understand the reasons why we've done that. And those reasons have been, historically, it's been to suit the political needs of the moment. The history of the West that we've told ourselves has always been the history of the West that we've needed to tell ourselves. And that kind of process of reinvention, historical reinvention, is something that is very Western. It's, we've got a long tradition of rethinking and reworking history in a kind of creative and innovative way, and we should not be stopping now.
Naoíse Mac Sweeney is professor of classic archaeology at the University of Vienna and has been a researcher at Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies. The new book is The West, A New History in 14 Lives. It is published by Dutton. Naoíse Mac Sweeney, I thank you so much for being with us. What a delight to have you on the program.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Be well. Again, the name of the book is The West, A New History in 14 Lives. You're listening